2. Webinar is now streaming on Facebook. Hello, Facebook. Hello, Zoom. I am going to share my screen. Okay. Welcome, everybody, to the Fox Cities Book Festival 2020. As you've probably noticed by now, things are a little bit different. We normally have people in person. Can't do that this year, so we're going virtual, and so far so good. We also have a program called Fox Cities Reads. Fox Cities Reads is usually in April, but again, it's a strange year. So that is running at the same time as the book festival. They're separate, but the same, but different. This year's Fox Cities Read is the late homecomer. If you haven't checked it out yet, please do. Here are some people enjoying what a normal book festival looks like when you get to come in and see a speaker live. Again, can't do that, but hopefully next year. And even though all the events we offer are free, unfortunately, that doesn't mean running things is free. So we do rely on grants and partners and donations and things of that sort to keep up and running. So thank you to those. Specifically today, we'd like to thank Alstrom. You should be able to see behind my head. Alstrom is the local paper mill here, and they are sponsoring our local history talks, our Wisconsin history talks today. So thank you, Alstrom. If you would like to donate, you can go to foxcitiesbookfestival.org. You can go to the Facebook page. You can mail a check. They always like that when you mail a check. If you'd like to support us by purchasing books, you can go to bookshop.org, and a percentage of that will go to the festival. It also supports our authors, which is wonderful because authors like it when people buy their books. That's sort of how they get paid. We do have a code of conduct. It's a very simple code of conduct. Basically, don't harass us. Don't send nasty messages to me, and please do not send nasty messages to our guests. If you do that, I will have to ask you to leave. And if you don't leave and you continue, I will kick you out. So don't do that. Just be respectful of other people and our guests. So now the moment you've been waiting for. Let's see, stop share. Okay, we've got with us today Robert Silbernagel, and I hope I'm saying your name correctly. Okay. Robert actually has a background here in Wisconsin. He studied journalism at UW-Madison. He then moved to Colorado, where he got into the newspaper business. He's worked at the newspapers for a number of years. I believe he still writes a column for the local newspaper. He's written on Colorado history. He's written on Aldo Leopold, the great naturalist. And today he's here to talk to us about his latest book about the Cadots, the fur trading family of northwestern Wisconsin. So, Robert, I will hand it off to you.
Thank you, Gavin. Well, hello, everyone. I am Robert Silbernagel, and welcome to my presentation. First of all, thank you to the Fox Cities Book Festival for having me as one of their authors this year. It's great to be able to participate, and I'm glad they're doing the festival this year, even if it is online. As Gavin said, I'm here to talk about my book, The Cadots, a fur trade family on Lake Superior. And I'd like to start with a short PowerPoint presentation. Then I'll talk some more about myself and my research, and I'll try and answer some of your questions. You can submit questions at the Q&A tab at the bottom of your screen there. So here goes. This is the cover of my book, which was published by the Wisconsin Historical Society Press and released this May. It's available at bookshop.org, as well as several bookshops in the Fox Cities area. The Cadats were French Canadians intermarried with Ojibwe Indians. They lived and worked around Lake Superior. And in my book, I focus a lot on Michel Cadat, who was French Canadian, but also part Ojibwe, and his Ojibwe wife, Ikwesiwe Cadat. They lived and traded on Madeline Island near present-day Bayfield, Wisconsin. The book also looks at Michel's father, Jean-Baptiste Cadat Sr., his brother, Jean-Baptiste Cadat Jr., as well as some of the descendants of Michel and Ikwesiwe Cadat. This drawing here shows French fur traders at La Baye, probably in the late 17th century, and La Baye we now know as Green Bay. Well, as Gavin mentioned, I live in the high desert of Colorado, and many people have asked me why I chose to write a book about Lake Superior. Well, the short answer is Lake Superior has long fascinated me. My wife, Judy, and I have visited the lake many times, especially the Bayfield and Madeline Island areas. This is a drawing of Madeline Island in the early 19th century. You can see the church in the background, some of the homes along the shore, the large warehouse and the dock reaching out into the lake with a small ship beside it, and some of the Native Americans in the foreground. Well, when visiting, I did what I do wherever I go visit, and I bought books about the area and its history. And I found that the name Cadat appeared often in some of the books, journals, and documents that I found. It also appeared in physical locations such as this. This is a plaque on Madeline Island showing the location where Michel and Ikwesiwe Cadat lived, raised their family, and operated their fur trading post. As I found out more information like this, I became intrigued with who the Cadats were, how they were involved in the fur trade in the Lake Superior region, and I began a decade-long research project to learn more about them. That research included, of course, many books and documents, but also some firsthand experiences. I went snowshoeing on a historic fur traders trail that reaches from Lake Superior down into the woods of northern Wisconsin, into an area where we know Michel Cadat traded. So it's likely he kayaking in areas on Lake Superior where we know Michel Cadat and Jean-Baptiste Cadat would have paddled their canoes. I'm no great adventurer, and I didn't try to recreate exactly the life of the Cadats in the late 18th and early 19th centuries. But I like to get a feel for the location and the lives of the people I write about and experience a little bit about how they lived and worked to try and better understand their lives and the fur trade existence. Well, you can't really explain the fur trade without giving some information about the creatures that were trapped almost to extinction and the industry that drove the demand for those creatures. I wasn't able to find any real estimates on how many beaver were trapped over the years. I did find some on bison or buffalo in North America, and experts estimate there were 30 million to 60 million bison killed in the 19th century when they were slaughtered almost to extinction. Well, based on records from fur trade posts that I found from the Hudson's Bay Company and the Northwest Company, I think there were probably 10 times as many beaver killed. That's 300 million to 600 million beaver killed, but that's over 300 years, not 1 century. In addition, there were many other animals trapped or shot to supply furs for the fur trade. That included fox, lynx, bear, wolf, moose, elk, deer, and bison, of course. But based on the records I've seen, beaver were far and away the #1 animal sought during the fur trade era. We also know that fur trapping initially involved many of the European colonies in North America. In fact, by the early 1600s, colonists colonists from Plymouth Rock to New York to Virginia were trapping and trading animals for their furs to help with their local economy. But eventually the good fur-bearing animals were largely trapped out, and those colonies switched to more agricultural endeavors. However, furs remained the mainstay of New France, which eventually became Eastern Canada, for several hundred years. That continued after the British took control of Canada in 1763, and when the United States took over the southern shores of Lake Superior and most of the Great Lakes following the War of 1812. The heyday of the fur trade continued into the 1840s. And during that time, millions of hats, fur felt hats, were made for fashionable gentlemen and ladies, and for those of us who just like to wear a top hat on a hike around the lake. Actually, this was done for a photo shoot, and I borrowed a top hat from a friend's father. We don't have any idea how many hats were made during this period, but we know that there was a considerable number of them. We also know that the first written reference for beaver felt hats that still exist today comes from Geoffrey Chaucer's Canterbury Tales, which was written in the late 1300s. And the drawing on the left shows the fashionable young merchant from the Canterbury Tales wearing what Chaucer described as a Flemish beaver hat. Well, Chaucer wrote his Canterbury Tales before Europeans arrived in large numbers to colonize North America. So the beaver for that felt hat and other felt hats at the time came primarily from Scandinavia or Russia, but they were mostly trapped out by the time Europeans began to colonize North America. So the North American beaver became a key resource. Over the years, many different styles of hats were developed, as you can see from the slide on the right. They included the Continental, the Navy hat, an Army hat, an early clerical hat, and several different styles of fashionable hats. Stetsons and derbies came later, and they're still being manufactured today, along with fedoras and top hats. Many of the hats today are made of rabbit fur or some fur. 100% beaver felt hats, but they're pretty expensive. Additionally, some hats today are made of buffalo fur or bison fur. In fact, I have a Stetson hat that's made of bison. Well, many companies were created to make felt hats, first in Europe, in England and France, Holland and Spain, and later North America. And the hats they made were shipped all over the world. This drawing shows an early factory manufacturing hats. One company today, Christie's and Company of England, has been making hats for 247 years. They made hats for King George III of England, who was the king during the American Revolution, and they made them for other members of the royal family. More recently, they've made hats for movies like The Godfather, and they still make top hats, bowlers, and fedoras today. Well, the early fur trade business was more than just about trappers that we may have come to know, such as Jim Bridger or Jeremiah Johnson. There were people like the man in this painting, who's Sir Alexander Mackenzie. He was knighted after he became the first European to cross North America and document his trip. He went from Montreal across the Great Lakes, across Lake Superior, then across southern Canada, the Great Plains, the Rocky Mountains, and he reached the Pacific Ocean in 1793. That was 12 years before Lewis and Clark made their famous expedition to the Pacific Ocean. Mackenzie was also the first European to reach the Arctic Ocean, and again, to document his trip. And he went by a route we now know as the Mackenzie River. But Mackenzie was not just an explorer. He was deeply involved in the fur trade business, first with the Northwest Company and then with a variety of other firms. And the Cadat brothers, Michel and Jean-Baptiste Jr., worked for his company in a variety of capacities. Jean-Baptiste was first an employee and then a partner in the company. Michel Cadat was an independent trader, but he traded for a time exclusively with the Northwest Company. Well, Mackenzie described the global fur trade as a very heavy business because it involved shipping furs to Europe, China, the Caribbean, and other locations, while having to pay heavy tariffs to companies like the British East India Company for using their ships to haul the furs and haul supplies back to Europe and back to North America. In addition, he said there was an entire lending industry created in Europe and North America just to serve the fur trade. And if there was a lot of transatlantic and transoceanic travel, the fur trade was also a long distance business just in North America. And this slide shows a canoe supply route that was used each year by voyagers and traders with the Northwest Company to go from Montreal down the Ottawa River, then into the Great Lakes, around Lake Superior to Grand Portage, where there was an annual rendezvous held each year. That's roughly 1,000 miles with quite a few portages for the canoes. And the Montreal folks would haul goods, trade goods and food out to Grand Portage, where they gave those goods to the wintering voyagers and traders, who had brought their furs from the previous winter into Grand Portage to be taken back to Montreal, shipped up the St. Lawrence River, and then on to Europe to be made into hats. The wintering voyagers and traders would then head back into the wilderness, some going as much as 1,000 or 1,500 miles west from Lake Superior to trap for furs themselves and trade with Native Americans to acquire more furs. The Cadat brothers attended those annual rendezvous on a number of occasions. We know from written records that still exist. They didn't head as far west into what's now Canada as some of the others did. They went primarily to northern Wisconsin, Minnesota, and the Upper Peninsula of Michigan with their voyager employees and their Indian relatives. Native. They too were much more than just backcountry trappers. Their family business ledgers showed they had complicated business, taking goods like cloth, pots, guns, tobacco, and traps into the backcountry to trade with other Native Americans, while at the same time keeping contact with merchants in Montreal to sell their furs, purchase trade goods, and look after their families who were in Montreal, possibly going to school at some time or engaged in business and other endeavors. Well, that's the end of my PowerPoint presentation. Now I'd like to just tell you a little bit more about myself. As Gavin mentioned, I'm a retired journalist. Was a journalist for almost 40 years, working exclusively in Colorado. And now I write a history column every few weeks. And I've written magazine columns and a number of other books. Most of my history writing, but not all of it until now, has been about the West, about Colorado and Utah, Arizona, New Mexico, and Wyoming. But my wife, Judy, and I grew up in southern Wisconsin, near Madison, and we still have family there and we visit regularly. And as I mentioned earlier, we visit Lake Superior regularly. And on one of those trips over the past 25 years, we've made our first visit to Madeline Island. We went to the museum there and visited the grave of Michel Cadat. That's when I began searching for books specifically about the Cadats, but I couldn't really find any. And I realized then that people of mixed ancestry, French Canadians mixed with Ojibwe Indians, such as the Cadats, didn't get written about, like the English, Scottish, and American pioneers of the area. Still, I found quite a few books, journals, and documents that mention the Cadets in some fashion. So Judy and I visited places around Lake Superior where the Cadets lived, worked, or traveled, and it's been a great ongoing adventure for both of us. During those trips and the research I was doing, we discovered a lot of people who were willing to help us out in our quest. There were academics and writers who conducted their own research about the Kadat, the Ojibwe Indians, or the fur trade in general. There were also people with museums and historical centers, from Madeline Island to Mackinac to Madison, at Grand Portage, Minnesota, and Thunder Bay, Ontario, and Sault Ste. Marie, Michigan, as well as Notre Dame University in Indiana, that helped me track down critical documents related to the Cadets or the fur trade, or just find other information, photos, drawings, maps, that kind of stuff. Members of different bands of the Ojibwe tribe helped me to understand a little bit about tribal history and tribal practices. Experts on trapping, wild rice gathering, maple sugar making, canoe manufacturing, canoe travel also help provide insight on fur trade activities to me. I'm very grateful that members of the Cadet family living today willingly shared details with me about their lives and their ancestors and their communities. I was invited to a Cadet family reunion at Red Cliff, Wisconsin, where I met members of the family living in Wisconsin, Minnesota, Michigan, and as far away as California. Well, no history book is a solo endeavor. So in addition to all the people I mentioned before, I had help from my wife, my children, and my siblings, and of course the editors and advisors at the Wisconsin Historical Society Press. So a big thank you to everyone who played a role in helping me to develop my Cadet book. Now, when I'm out in public talking about my history projects, I often get asked, what was the most surprising or interesting thing you learned during your research? Well, there were a lot of intriguing items with the Cadet book. I'm amazed at how much long distance travel occurred, as that map in the last slide I showed demonstrated. And the fact that that sort of travel was undertaken by canoe, foot, snowshoes, and dog sled under pretty rough conditions most of the time, in all kinds of, well, were some parts of the fur region, primarily in the Great Plains and Rocky Mountains, not so much in Lake Superior area. And that backcountry travel was undertaken by people wearing wool, buckskin, and fur clothing. And they often had to rely on food they could scavenge along the way to keep from starving. All of that just reinforced my belief, and I'm sure a lot of people accept it, that the fur traders and the Indian allies, their Indian allies, and all the people in the backcountry at that time were just incredibly hardy people. I was surprised to learn how early in history beaver fur hats had become fashionable and how long they drove what was in fact the most important economic industry in much of the Northwest, as it was called then, that included Eastern Canada and the Great Lakes region. I was intrigued to learn how complicated the global fur trade was, and the fact that it involved French Canadians and Native Americans, trappers and traders working in the backcountry, but also merchants and financiers in Montreal, New York, London, and Paris. And as I mentioned, people like the Cadets dealt with both ends of that trading chain. They had to maintain relationships with natives and French Canadian voyagers, as well as urban merchants who sold their furs, provided them goods, and gave them credit. I was struck by how important the French Canadians were to the region, and the fact that they often married Native Americans whose clans became their allies. But I was surprised to realize how little mention they got in the Anglo records through the 20th century even. I grew up in Wisconsin, attended public schools there, and I learned very little about the French Canadians who played such an important role in Wisconsin's history. I was interested by how much Native rivalry there was, not just between groups like the Dakota and Ojibwe, who were often enemies, but sometimes allies, but among different bands of the same tribe. And to learn that the French, British, and American traders and government officials used those rivalries to further their own interests. And even though I'm familiar with Indian issues across the country, and I know how frequently treaties were broken, I was surprised how badly the Ojibwe were treated during treaty negotiations in the early 19th century that led to a number of different treaties that were signed and then, of course, broken or changed and new treaties required. I was especially appalled with the Sandy Lake tragedy that occurred in 1850 when several hundred Ojibwe men, women, and children died. I've written a little bit about that in my book, and others have written more about the tragedy. It remains one of the worst Indian tragedies of this continent. But it was also important to realize that the Ojibwe leaders at the time were tough negotiators and their people remained strong. And despite deceit and trickery by some government officials, they rejected efforts to have them move from their homeland into north central Minnesota. And most of the Lake Superior Ojibwe were able to remain in their homeland, although on much smaller reservations than the territory they once occupied. And it's also interesting to note that some of the treaty provisions they demanded in the early 19th century are still having repercussions today. But I guess more than anything that I discovered as I was researching and writing the Cadotte book, I was amazed by how resilient the Cadotte family was and many other families like them during a time of astounding political and economic change. Michel Cadotte was born in 1764 in a region that was still very loyal to the French, a year after the French had supposedly ceded Canada to the British. But he grew up under British rule and worked first as an independent British trader. Then he worked, as I mentioned, as an exclusive trader for the British Northwest Company. During his lifetime, international wars and treaties changed who controlled his home, and he had to adapt to new political and economic rules. Eventually, he became an American trading on Madeline Island. And he had to work with John Jacob Astor's American Fur Company in order to have a market for his furs. But that's just part of the upheaval he and his family faced. Let me read a short piece from my book that I think helps illustrate this. It's from chapter 19, A Method to Their Marriage. Nothing in the record of Michel Cadotte's life suggests that he was impetuous or that he and his partner Quisue were prone to making spur-of-the-moment decisions. So when they decided to get married in a Catholic church in 1830, more than 40 years after they first became husband and wife under Ojibwe custom, they must have had good reason. In fact, they had multiple reasons to have their marriage recognized under European American rules. Notably, important court cases were changing how marriages between European men and Native women were viewed by authorities. Treaties had been forged that made marriage issues more significant for mixed ancestry couples like the Cadottes. And substantial cultural changes were on the horizon as the first of the Protestant missionaries began to arrive at Lake Superior. It became apparent that Michel and Quisue were responding to the changing circumstances of their world. They were demonstrating the same adaptability and resiliency they had shown at different periods in their lives when situations demanded change. Much of my book highlights those character traits, that determination to survive, to maintain family and community, despite the great changes that were facing them. I hope if you read my book, as you read it, you will come to appreciate this about the Cadat family and others like them as much as I have. Thank you for listening to my presentation, and I'll try and answer some questions now.
All right. Robert, can you hear me?
Yes, I can, Gavin.
Okay. I don't know if I can turn my video back on or if Angela has to do that. But okay. Oh, there we go. Thank you. I'm back.
Okay.
All right. So first of all, you mentioned that the French Canadians didn't get written about very much, and I agree with that 100%. So I thank you for writing the book on the Cadets. I loved it, and I love the fact that you approached it. I approach history in a genealogical way, and I felt like you did a lot of that same approach. So I really liked your approach on telling the story.
Thank you.
But yeah, we have that here too. I mean, we're in the sort of the Green Bay area, huge French Canadian settlement, but there aren't really any popular books. I mean, there's a lot of scholarly work, but for the general reader, there's really nothing out there. Yeah. So you filled a gap, and I appreciate that.
Good.
Okay, so to the questions. First, we have a question from Margaret, and this is, I guess it's an ethical question. She says that she has an old ivory necklace that she no longer wears because of ethical concerns about where it came from. How do you feel about wearing fur today that may have been questionably, gained, I guess?
That's an interesting one, and it goes to like felt hats. As I said, you can still get beaver felt hats, but they come exclusively from trapping beaver, primarily in Canada. But as you know, you can still do some trapping in Wisconsin. Mm-hmm. I have my own thoughts about trapping and how ethical it is, and that's one of the reasons I thought the bison, which were domestically raised and then the furs gathered as meat was gathered, I thought that was a little better. I think it's something we've got to choose for ourselves. I guess if I had historical items that I had trouble, didn't want to wear, didn't want to use at all, I might look for them them to or something like that. Does that answer that question?
I can't speak for them, but it sounds okay to me. Okay, a question from, it looks like Jill. She's curious, how long was the research process for this book?
I would say, I began to be aware of the Cadets early in the 2000s, but I was working on another book about Native Americans out here in Colorado at the time. So really, I began to focus exclusively on this about 2010, 2011. And then a lot of it was done online and acquiring books from libraries or purchasing books. My wife has gotten somewhat tired of my book purchases, but oh well. So probably a concerted research effort lasted roughly a decade.
Okay. I know the answer to this question is yes, but maybe you can elaborate. Is Cadat, Wisconsin connected to the Cadat family?
Yes, it is. And there's several, I've seen several different stories about which Cadat it was named for, but the one that seems most likely is that it was named for one of the Cadats' descendants, a son of Michel Nkweswe, who operated a fur trade post there. Which river is it? I've forgotten now which river it's on, but operated a fur trade post, and then another member of the family later was involved in a sawmill operation there as well. But I think it was named for the son of son of Michel and Ikweswe Kadat, one of their sons.
All right. So for a while, the Kadats were working for John Jacob Astor, as many fur traders did. Did you run across any, I don't know the right way to say this, but shady business practices by Astor? I've seen in other situations where they would give out loans to the fur traders that they could not possibly pay back.
There was a lot of concern, and part of the stuff that led to the Sandy Lake tragedy was concern about alcohol being too freely dispersed, although it was throughout much of the fur trade history. And one of the chapters in my book looks at Michel and Ikweswe's son-in-law, Lyman Truman, who took over the fur trade business on Madeline Island from Michel and Ikweswe, and then became a small partner, but also an employee of the American Fur Company, and was booted out and had federal charges filed against him. And they basically treated him pretty poorly over some fairly minor things. So yeah, there were some shady dealings there that caused problems with the family and with others around the Madeline Island area. And for a while, that was the critical spot for the American Fur Company in Lake Superior. I think they also had a Green Bay post, didn't they?
They did, yes.
Yeah, but those were the two key posts in what was then the Northwest for the American Fur Company, with a bunch of smaller posts, obviously.
All right, so the Kadats in particular were intermarried with the Ojibwe. How did this affect the French that were not intermarried? Did that cause them to align themselves with the Ojibwe as opposed to other tribes in the area, or just the intermarried families?
The French, I think, were pretty clever in this respect. They aligned themselves with all sorts of different groups, except the Iroquois Confederacy. Those guys were always the bad guys as far as the French were concerned. But there were French intermarried or allied with the Potawatomi, the Ho-Chunk, several different nations of Fox. They worked with all of them, and they worked hard, and the British followed up on this to prevent intertribal rivalries from resulting in actual violence, because that disrupted the trade, and they wanted to keep the trade going as much as possible. So I don't think it wasn't that because the Kadats or others who were married into the Ojibwe, they weren't necessarily at odds with other French Canadians, but there were other French Canadians that worked more closely with different tribes as well.
Okay. Yeah, and around here, there's definitely the French Menominee.
Yeah.
It runs very deep. I don't think you touched on this. Do you happen to know what role they played, if any, in the War of 1812? Because maybe people don't know this, but Wisconsin was not generally on the side of the U.S. during the War of 1812.
Yeah, you're right. And in fact, there is two of Michel and Ikweswe's sons, one who was, of course, named Michel Kadat as well. So I use him as Michel Jr. And another son. Both served on the British side during the War of 1812 as interpreters. It's not clear that they were involved in direct combat, but they were involved. There's some newspaper articles and other evidence that suggests they helped prevent a massacre of some Americans on Mackinac Island during the war, early in the war, and were also present later on. Now, it's interesting that their grandson, Michel Nkwesowe's grandson, William Warren, who wrote first book-length biography, I guess, of the Ojibwe tribe, talked about his uncles being involved in the War of 1812. He was writing at a time when the Americans had control of this area, and he wanted to put the best face on his family, I think. He said his uncles were basically pressed into service for the British. There's other evidence that they were actually volunteers for the British. And there were a number of Ojibwe, possibly including Chief Buffalo from Madeline Island, who also served on behalf of the British during the War of 1812.
Okay. Yeah, I always find that fascinating, that the way that we're taught American history is that everything starts out on the East Coast and moves west.
Yeah.
So I don't know about Colorado, but Wisconsin fits in there as part of this expansion west. And we leave out the fact that, the natives were obviously here first, then the French, then the British. There's all this stuff that we never talk about because it's not the American part of the story.
Right. Yeah.
So I think it's fascinating how many different countries were actually here.
And not to digress too far, but in Colorado, in addition to the natives, the first settlement came up from New Mexico, from Mexico and New Mexico, and it was Spanish. So, and that's getting more and more written about now. But again, it's not something that was written about a lot. It was always, as you said, this east to west expansion of basically Americans, European Americans.
Okay, we have another question that came in. We're diverging a little bit, but it's a question that I know you know something about. Can you tell us about the book you wrote about the natives from Colorado? What time frame did you cover? Was it more current than the Pueblo? I'm not even gonna try that. Okay, is it more current than the tribes near Mesa Verde?
Yes. So here it is. It's called Troubled Trails. It's the Meeker Affair and the expulsion of Utes from Colorado. And it involves battle and killings that occurred in northwestern Colorado in 1979 that led to basically most of the Utes being removed from Colorado. And it was probably, I wouldn't be living where I am today without that, all of that occurring, because this, until 1880, was Ute reservation in Colorado. So it's about 19th century events that affected the Utes and affected Colorado.
Okay. I have no idea how to follow that one up because I know nothing about that, but.
It's a fascinating story, but not part of the Wisconsin story. So.
Sure. Correct me if I'm wrong, but I believe you were in contact with descendants of the Cadots while writing?
Yes.
I don't know what you can or can't say about that, how that worked.
There are several different ones I was in contact with. One gentleman who lived in Duluth has since passed away. Another lives in the area around Red Cliff, Wisconsin. He's been very helpful, and try and meet with him whenever I go back in that area. And he and his family make wonderful maple syrup that he's given me several bottles of, so I enjoy that. There's also an elderly former Catholic nun and teacher who worked all over the country, but is a descendant of the Cadots and has moved back. And I met with her. She's actually the woman who invited me to the Cadot family reunion at Red Cliff. And they've shared stories about their family, their history, what they know. The one gentleman that gives me the maple syrup, he showed me an Ancestry.com family tree he and his daughter developed, and they were, I think, 7 generations descended from Michelle and Equaceaway Cadat. So, and it's interesting, as you know, there's the town of Cadats. There are lots of Cadats still around in Wisconsin and other parts of the country.
Were they able to share with you like family lore that may or may not be true, but stories that have been passed down?
A little bit, not much of it went back as far as the late 18th, early 19th century, but some did go back to mid 19th century, early 20th century. And the lands where Michelle and Equaceaway had their trading post had been passed down to Cadat family through succeeding generations until it finally sold, I think, to some other outside the family sometime in the 1950s or 1960s. So they were able to talk about that and talk a little bit about visiting that historic family property when they were younger.
Okay. The Cadat brothers that you focused on, would you say that they were just an example of fur traders, or would you say that they were hugely important, influential figures? Where do they fall?
Well, I think they're pretty important. I think I used them as sort of a representative family of the French Canadian fur traders, but in Western Lakes Superior region, they were very important. They were some of the leaders. The brother, Jean-Baptiste, with Michel with him, sometime late in the 1700s, made a famous trip into Minnesota, all the way over to probably the Dakotas now. And even though the Northwest Company was actually sending traders into Southern Canada at the time, they hadn't been sending them into that particular area of what's now northern Wisconsin and the Dakotas. So he helped open that area up to the trade, which is primarily occupied by Dakota Indians at that time. And then Madeline Island, it seems it's this kind of neat touristy place now, nice recreation spot. But for a long time, beginning with the French and then off and on by Europeans. But for a long time, it was the key trading post, trading location for Western Lake Superior. And it continued to be when Michelle and Equaceaway were there. I'm kind of discounting Grand Portage, Minnesota. That was where the annual rendezvous was, and that was huge as well. But Duluth and Superior didn't exist then, so the canoes and even some sailing ships began using Madeline Island as the key trading location on the southern shores of Lake Superior. So
Okay.
that was a long-winded answer. They were both a representative family, but they were also important in their own right. And I haven't found any other family that was involved in the fur trade for so long in basically the same locations, that being the West End and at Sault Ste. Marie over several hundred years.
Okay. So it's again, it's one of those things where those French Canadians just don't make their way into history. So
Yeah.
The Cadats weren't even on my radar prior to your book. So did they have any run-ins with any rival traders? As an example, the traders in Green Bay were expanding down towards the Prairie du Chien area. And there was a trader in Prairie du Chien named Joseph Roulette. And they would get in these spats and they would burn each other's trading posts, just trying to like edge each other's territory out. Did you run into any stories like that where they were competing for space?
Yeah, I did with Michel Cadat. There was a story of a some other. So Michel's working for the Northwest Company. There was a rival company that didn't last long, but for a number of years, they operated in the same territory. There's a story at one point that Michel and some of his voyagers were paddling in canoes along west of the Apostle Islands, over towards the Duluth area, and these rival traders fired cannon shot at them from the shore as they were passing by. Now, one of the people who witnesses said the guys on shore were probably so drunk that they couldn't have hit him if they tried, but there was an effort to discourage them and also to discourage Michel and Equaceaway, and also to go into their trading area and establish trading posts in rivalry with them, and gather Indian allies, get the Ojibwe there to trade with them as opposed to Michel and Equaceaway. And there's a couple of instances where that reportedly happened. One guy who's out in the backcountry of northern Wisconsin says Michel and Equaceaway staying at home at this point because they have a number of kids. But Michel comes in with his voyageurs, French Canadians and Indian allies to set up camp, but this one guy's already there, and he says, okay, you can stay here, but you can't go out and trade with any of my Indian allies because I was here first. And so there were a number of incidents like that, yeah.
Okay, this is a question, this is probably more for me than for anybody else. I don't know if this is of interest to anybody. For somebody who would want to learn more about this era, where can we go for the source materials? Where would we find these stories that just aren't in the public record?
Some of that is available, and if you look at the notes in my book, you can look at some of those source materials, but it's difficult. There are some great papers up at the Wisconsin Historical Society in Ashland at what's that called? The Northwest Center?
The Area Research Center?
Yes, yeah.
Okay.
We had some great, and they were a lot of help. There are some books like journals. Alexander Mackenzie wrote a journal. David Thompson, who worked first for the Hudson Bay Company and then later for the Northwest Company, wrote a journal that's probably one of the better written ones. And he met Baptiste and Michel and them in his book, although they're not huge parts of the book, but his is an excellent account of what fur trade life was like in the backcountry. I was able to track down, it's interesting just how much things have changed. I was able to track down a lot of different journals and historic books on Google Books. And that made it easier. I didn't have to track down hard copies of books in libraries as much as I did earlier when I was researching my other books. So, but I would start there, look at some of the sources in my book, and there's a lot of different books out there, but the journals of Mackenzie and David Thompson, I think, are very good sources.
Okay. Yeah, it's not an area that I've spent too much time with, but the little bit that I have, the problem you run into is so many of these things, if they even exist, which most don't, but if they exist, they're all in French and Latin, which I'm terrible at, so.
And even some of it is in the French stuff's in 18th century French Canadian, which I've shown to people who speak French, and they have trouble with that because it's not like Parisian French or anything like that.
Okay. Well, if anybody has any questions, please add them now. We're down to our last 5 minutes. I think I've kind of exhausted my list of questions, but Robert, any thoughts that have popped up during this conversation?
Well, I'd just, again, like to thank you guys, the Fox Cities Book Festival, and everybody who took time to participate. And I think it is a fascinating part of our history, Wisconsin history, but also US history that I'm glad I got the chance to learn more about, and I'd just like to share it with other folks. So.
Very good. Well, we've got the generic question here. What do you have going on next? Are you planning another book already, or is there an area of research you're focusing on, and can you talk about it?
Well, I'm working on a piece of historical fiction set out in Colorado, but at the same time, I've been doing a lot of research on my great-grandfather, John Jacob Silbernagel, who immigrated from Germany in the 1840s, served in the Civil War in the Iron Brigade, and also served on the Madison City Council for a number of years. And I don't know where that's going. Maybe it'll be just something for my family and I, but it's been very interesting following up. And I mean, there are thousands of immigrants who came to Wisconsin and served in the Civil War and helped establish different governments and different businesses here. But for me, it's personally satisfying to look into that. So whether
Sure.
that becomes something for the public or just for my family, I don't know.
That's understandable. But granted, not every one of them has a grandson who's a professional writer. So you can add a little flourish that not everybody could add.
That's true. Well, I hope so anyway.
Yeah. But yeah, I understand that. I mean, again, I love genealogy, so there's all kinds of family stories that I love, but I don't know who would care. But
Just your other family members, huh?
yeah. I guess that's about it. We got, a minute or two, but we can wrap this up. Robert, thank you very much for your time. I found it fascinating. I hope other people found it fascinating. This really is a piece of Wisconsin history that, we all know happened, but nobody really knows much about. So thank you for being the one who, went out into the wilderness and wrote this book. We need it. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Gavin. Thank you, guys, the Fox Cities Book Festival for having me here. And
All
I
right.
appreciate it.
Yeah, well, have a good day, Robert. And if you write that book, we'll see you next year.
All right. Bye-bye.
Have a good day.